Lovecraft was an American author from the early 20th century. He's quite a tragic literary figure because although he died when he was 46, he was still quite young, and he died before he'd ever had any kind of financial success with his stories. So he'd never really achieved any real professional success through his writing. But it didn't stop him, which is one of the greatest things about him. And it's just one of those sort of, if only he could have lived longer and written more, especially as he mainly wrote short stories, and he wrote some longer stories, all just on the border of becoming novels, and those were all at the end of his life. So obviously if he'd have lived, potentially he'd have written whole novels and expanded on some of the mythologies that he created in his stories. So it's tragic, but there we go. Like I said, he mainly wrote short stories. He was part of a group of literary figures, and they all wrote stories together in a similar style, very pulpy, mainly for these early American pulp magazines like Weird Tales magazine. And they all kind of would submit their own different ideas, and they all wrote to each other and talked to each other about these ideas and shared different things. And in the group, Lovecraft was considered the master. He was the best. They all looked up to him and listened to his opinion more than any others. But like I said, professionally, the rest of the world didn't kind of agree at the time, which is a real shame. So probably the most famous of his friends was Robert E. Howard, who created Conan, and also Robert Bloch was another one who wrote Psycho, which obviously went on to make the movie. And then there was a few other guys who were also relatively famous. And like I said, they would send their stories to Lovecraft. He worked as an editor, that was his job. So he would edit the stories, he would add paragraphs where he thought they should be, sort of expand on their stories in ways that he thought would work. And then he'd send them back, and they'd immediately send them off to be published either in the magazines or in different ways. So they had an enormous amount of respect for him to let him do that to their stories, and then to just publish them as they were. So eventually he looked to get his own work published, but he had been writing throughout most of his life. So he started out with what are known as the Dreamland stories. So he was a really big fan of Lord Dunsany, who's a British fantasy writer who wrote high fantasy, so like elves, dwarves, all that kind of stuff. So he wanted to write in that kind of style, and he created his own sort of epic fantasy world. And his idea was, when you go to sleep and you start dreaming, you actually go sort of spiritually to this kind of other dimension, and it's a set place, so other dreamers can visit the same place, and it's got set places in it, and every night you can return to this same place and you can explore it and you can have adventures, that kind of thing. But because it's in the dream, there are no rules like gravity or any kind of physics are completely out the window. So his imagination just went crazy on it. Personally, I'm not really a fan of the Dreamland stories. I think they are a bit too over the top and crazy and weird, and they're not really very gothic, and I prefer the gothic kind of stuff. That's what I'm into. So he worked on those for a while. There's quite a lot of stories. Some of them are pretty long as well. But then he started writing more kind of grounded, realistic, weird fiction, kind of a bit like Edgar Allan Poe. He was a huge fan of Edgar Allan Poe. And then because obviously he's famous for his Cthulhu Mythos, but the funny thing about it is that it wasn't something that he set out right from the get-go. He didn't create the mythology and then start writing little stories. He started writing these little stories with a weird twist, and then as they went along, he started taking elements that he heard in the previous story and putting them into this new story. So like an old book was mentioned in the old story, it would show up again in the new story, or characters or monsters, things like that. So the mythos kind of developed slowly over time. It wasn't any permanently set out thing beforehand. Having said that, it all works. There weren't too many like loopholes or anything like that. And it's absolutely fantastic. It's one of the great kind of things about the Cthulhu Mythos is that it's not very pulpy, basically. It's not some kind of muscle-bound hero like Indiana Jones, some obvious guy fighting the good fight. Most of the heroes are doctors or librarians or dusty old professors. They're not the sort of people that you expect. But there's this whole kind of academia to his stories. It's like academic thrillers, basically. So everything's all about, he's really into the occult, and he loved like old, thick, leather-bound tomes that had terrible secrets inside them. He loved ancient mythologies, sort of coming back to life, that kind of thing. I mean, and that was the main thing. His monsters are all sort of, the overall idea is that before the dawn of man, and even before the dawn of dinosaurs, the world was populated by ancient races, and those died out, and they died out and were wiped clean from the earth. So there's there's almost no remnants, and the only remnants are kept on either in our sort of deep subconscious, which is obviously keying into his whole Dreamlands ideas, or they're buried deep under the ground, and it's more like they're more like volcanoes, so they just lie dormant for millennia, as opposed to being actual monsters. And they're much more psychological. They're not just like dinosaurs. They have like a psychological power. So, for example, the most famous one, Cthulhu, even when he's dreaming, he has a mental effect on the whole planet's psychology, basically. So it's very interesting. It's very, very cool. Part of that idea, this whole academic thing, and the Edgar Allan Poe thing, he created a kind of character. So a lot of people criticize his writing style. It's supposed to be in the way it is. The way it is really, really, really over-descriptive and kind of archaic in a sort of really elaborate way. And people criticize it, but he did it on purpose. That was the point, was to be like that. Is to add this kind of Edgar Allan Poe-ish sort of flair to the whole thing. And some of it is really hilarious. I think like a lot of the comedy is missed by by people that read it and don't get it. Like, I do think he was very funny, but also like really fantastic, very descriptive. But they're good descriptions, they're interesting to read. It's fun. It's almost like a comic book, like in written form. It's like, big, colourful and bright, basically. So in terms of buying collections, it can be quite difficult because there are so many stories, and if you get like a big version that's got all of them in, like this one, I mean, they literally just lump it all in chronological order of when he wrote it, which means that you get a whole mix of Dreamland stories and Cthulhu Mythos stories and other stories all mixed together. So if you were to work through it like that, you might find it kind of hard work. Personally, I started with this because I wasn't really sure, so I just bought this, and it was $2.99. Wordsworth editions, but it's actually, even now when I look at it, this is the best reading order that you could probably have, in my opinion. So it's Dagon, The Nameless City, The Hound, The Festival, The Call of Cthulhu, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, which is my favourite, The Dunwich Horror, The Whisper in Darkness, and then it finishes with The Mountains of Madness. So The Mountains of Madness is one of his almost novels, as well as Charles Dexter Ward. The only main story missing really from this collection is The Shadow over Innsmouth. Other than that, this is a really solid reading order, which I would recommend. If you were to get the smaller collections, there's quite a few of them. Like, this is one of the most popular ones. This is like the American versions. That's volume 2, volume 3. I don't even have volume 1. Again, these ones, because these collect the whole lot, they mix it all up, so you get like a whole different mix of them. So it can be quite hard to know which ones to read and which ones not to read. Personally, I would say definitely Dagon, obviously Call of Cthulhu, and then one of the longer ones like Mountains of Madness, Charles Dexter Ward, Shadow over Innsmouth. One of those ones is always a good way to start. But if you already think you're interested, then just go and buy the whole lot. Why not? There's plenty of different types. This one is apparently 20 quid. I'm sure you can probably get it cheaper than that. A lot of people say that the versions of the stories in this aren't as great as the ones in Barnes and Nobles. They use a different edit, but it's such a small change, I imagine, that I don't think it's that big a deal. I mean, I've reread some of the ones in here that I've read in here and in here, and I can't really tell the difference. It's not that big a deal, so don't worry about it. So yeah, either this one, which I love because just look at it. It actually looks like the Necronomicon. How cool is that? Or the Barnes and Nobles one, or individual ones. I mean, it's really just up to you. The interesting thing about his monsters is that he went with this I think it's a really clever literary technique where he doesn't really describe any of the monsters. So everything's like unimaginable evil or indescribable monstrosity. And, you know, somebody might criticize that and say that it's like a cheat because he's not actually describing what his monster is. But actually what he's doing is he's making you come up with it in your mind. And your imagination is always going to be much worse than what somebody else can describe, or much better. You know what I mean. So the funny thing is that, like, personally I think that whenever you watch whenever they make a movie or a cartoon or even a comic book or anything like that, it's always a disappointment, it's always a letdown compared with Lovecraft's own written stories, because the way he wrote his monsters being unimaginable or indescribable, and having me create my own version in my mind, when you see somebody else's version, it's never as good, it's never as shocking or terrifying. Plus, a lot of his monsters are so terrible that just to see them will drive you mad. So when you watch a movie and you see it and you're not driven insane by it, again, a bit of a letdown. But there we go, that's just one of those weird things. Not to say that any of the movies haven't done a very, very good job. They do, but it's just nobody could ever do it as well as the story Monsters in Your Mind, basically. It's a bit of a shame. So I would definitely recommend reading some Lovecraft stories. On whatever collection you get, I'm sure that you'll enjoy some of it. And I think that the tragedy of his life really adds something to it. It enriches the stories. So give it a try, and there we go.